So, you think you could survive as a Roman gladiator, strut into the arena, flex some muscles, maybe flash a winning smile at the emperor? Cute. Reality check. You'd be lucky to survive breakfast. Gladiators weren't action heroes. They were expendable entertainment, living in cramped cells, eating gruel, and dodging death on the daily. Forget Hollywood. Real gladiators trained like beasts, fought like chess masters, and died like footnotes. If you think a couple of gym sessions and a protein shake would save you, think again. Here's exactly why you wouldn't last a day in the arena. Welcome to Gladiator School, Ludus, where dreams go to die, and so do you, eventually. Forget any ideas you have about heroic training montages and inspirational music swelling in the background. This wasn't a sports camp. It was a brutal meat grinder designed to turn men into living weapons or dead examples. First, let's talk accommodations. Gladiators in training didn't get comfy dorm rooms or a welcome basket. Instead, they were thrown into cramped, dark barracks that looked more like livestock pens than housing. Tiny stone cells, no beds, no privacy, and just enough room to collapse from exhaustion. And if you thought solitary confinement was bad, remember, these guys paid for their mistakes in broken ribs and dislocated shoulders. Once enrolled, the first rule was simple: obey or suffer. Ludus life was all about total control. Gladiators were property, bought, sold, and punished at their master's whim. Most were slaves captured from conquered lands, though some free men, crushed by debt or thirsting for fame, volunteered. Spoiler, that was almost always a terrible life decision. Every morning started with the ancient Roman equivalent of rise and grind, only minus the motivational Instagram quotes. You were yanked out of bed at dawn and marched straight to the palestra, the training yard. Here you were expected to train from sunup to sundown. Think military boot camp, only harsher and with way worse dental care. The day kicked off with warm-ups, which, to Roman standards, meant beating each other senseless with wooden swords, rudis. These wooden weapons weren't light practice, toys either. They were deliberately heavier than real swords to build strength. Swinging one for hours wasn't just tiring. It felt like trying to lift a tree trunk repeatedly while your muscles begged for mercy. Footwork drills came next. Gladiators had to be quick on their feet, so trainers, called doctores, put them through endless rounds of lunges, dodges, and pivots, often while carrying full armor in the sweltering Mediterranean heat. The goal was agility. You needed to move like a cat, hit like a bull, and endure punishment like a stone wall. And punishment wasn't optional. It was a daily special. Mess up a drill? Expect a whipping. Show weakness? Double whipping. Look at your trainer funny. Guess what? Triple whipping. Gladiator trainers weren't there to encourage you. They were there to break you, your spirit, your body, your will. Now, let's talk nutrition, or the shocking lack thereof. The gladiator diet was about as glamorous as the living conditions. Forget the steak and protein shakes. Gladiators were nicknamed hordeari, barley men, because their diets were packed with cheap carbs like barley porridge and beans. Why? Carbs gave them a little more body fat, which actually helped cushion wounds during fights. Yep, gladiators were deliberately bulkier than your average Hollywood six-pack model. The ideal physique wasn't ripped abs. It was slightly squishy, but hard to kill. Water. Good luck. Access to clean drinking water was laughable. Most gladiators were chronically dehydrated, training in 90-degree heat, fueled by barley mush and rage. Imagine running a marathon every day while malnourished and getting smacked with sticks. Welcome to your new life. Injuries were, of course, part of the package. Sprains, fractures, dislocated joints. The doctors couldn't have cared less. Gladiators were patched up crudely, if at all. A snapped ankle or a busted rib, tape it up and get back in the ring. No days off, no mercy. And hygiene? Non-existent. After 12 hours of sweat, dirt and blood, gladiators didn't shower. They stewed. Infection was a constant threat. Open wounds festered. Fevers ran rampant. And gangrene was a frequent, uninvited guest. There were no antibiotics, just grim acceptance. Then there were the chains. Oh yes, the chains. Trainee gladiators were often shackled at night to prevent escape. Wrists, ankles, sometimes even necks. Dreaming of freedom? Forget it. Dreaming at all? Hard to do when you're chained to the guy next to you who hasn't bathed in a month and snores like a dying ox. And let's not pretend you were getting a proper education. Literacy wasn't in the curriculum. Gladiators weren't supposed to think. They were supposed to react. You trained to obey commands without hesitation. Attack. Defend. Kill. No questions, no second guesses. Overthinking got you dead. Still not convinced you'd tap out after one day? Consider this. Gladiator schools often tested new trainees by pitting them against each other in mock fights that were anything but mock. Survival was the only grade. You passed if you lived. You failed. Well, no retakes. The harshest part? This was just the beginning. Surviving Ludus didn't guarantee a long career or any respect, just the chance to risk your life in front of a bloodthirsty crowd who'd boo you for slipping on your own entrails. Bottom line, Gladiator School wasn't about building you up. It was about grinding you down until you were the perfect mix of fear, strength, and obedience. If the starvation, the beatings, and the infections didn't kill you, the mental strain would. Because the moment you stepped into the arena, you'd realize the training was the easy part. Let's get something straight. Those chiseled, muscle-bound warriors you see in movies. Completely wrong. Real gladiators weren't Greek statues come to life. They were more like power lifters who lost access to a gym and a nutritionist. First, air bodies. Forget washboard abs. Gladiators weren't aiming to impress anyone with Instagram-worthy aesthetics. They needed mass, not for flexing but for survival. More body fat actually helped absorb blows and minimize deep cuts. A lean, shredded fighter looked great, right up until his thin skin split open like a grape at the first whack of a sword. In fact, archaeological studies on gladiator remains, yes, they actually dug up ancient gladiator graveyards, show these fighters had relatively high body fat and thick bone density. They weren't skinny and ripped. They were stocky, solid, and yes, a little soft around the middle, kind of like if you crossed a heavyweight wrestler with a linebacker who forgot leg day. Now, about that diet. No, they weren't scarfing down chicken breasts and protein bars. Gladiators were called hordeari, or barley men, because their primary fuel was, you guessed it, barley. Their daily intake was heavy on grains, beans, and lentils. Protein was rare and came mostly from plants, not steaks. Meat was a luxury, not a staple. A typical gladiator meal might look something like this: barley porridge, maybe some boiled beans, a sad little fig for dessert, and a big helping of not enough. Protein deficiency was common. Calcium, too, was lacking, which led the Romans to create a weird solution, a bone ash drink. Yes, they actually drank a mixture of vinegar and charred bone to boost their calcium intake. Kind of makes your post-workout protein shake seem a lot more appealing, right? And about hydration. Don't even think about coconut water or electrolyte drinks. Most of their hydration came from plain water, if they were lucky, or watered down. Sour wine called Posca. Not exactly Gatorade. Add in the constant training under the Mediterranean sun, and you've got a dehydration nightmare that no amount of barley water could fix. Modern fitness culture loves to romanticize the ancient workout. Battle ropes, kettlebells, all that gritty primal stuff. But here's the thing. Gladiator training wasn't optimized for health. It was optimized for one thing, keeping you alive just long enough to die in public. Injuries weren't carefully rehabbed. Overtraining wasn't a concern. If you collapsed from exhaustion, you didn't get a day off. You got dragged off. And let's not pretend gladiators were all towering hunks. Sure, there were some big guys, but Rome's love for spectacle meant you also had all kinds. Short, wiry, nimble fighters, tall, lumbering tank types, even specially. Themed matchups like dwarf gladiators versus wild animals. Brutal? Absolutely. Politically correct? Not even close. Another thing to kill your ancient action hero fantasy. Gladiators didn't get custom-fit armor designed for mobility. They fought in massive, heavy gear designed more for spectacle than practicality. Helmets with tiny eye slits restricted their vision and made it hard to breathe. Some armor weighed over 20 kilograms. That's like strapping on a small child. Before going into mortal combat, so even if you were strong, the gear wore you down fast. Cardio day. Try sprinting in a tin can with 10 pounds of sweat pooling under your helmet. Speaking of sweat, there's no polite way to say this. They stank. Bad. No deodorant, no daily baths, and a diet rich in legumes. You do the math. Training yards. Smelled like a combination of wet dog, bean stew, and despair. If the sword didn't kill you, the stench might. Gladiators also didn't have rest days. Recovery was a luxury only champions earned. Everyone else trained on shredded muscles, sprained ankles, and maybe a busted rib or two. Ancient Rome didn't believe in listening to your body. You were expected to power through the pain, or get punished for weakness. Medical care was rudimentary at best. Gladiators had access to doctors called medici. But these weren't your kindly family physicians. They were battlefield surgeons more familiar with amputating limbs than delicate procedures. And anesthesia, not even a concept. If you needed surgery, you got some wine to dull the agony and a wooden stick to bite down on. If you were lucky, you survived with a few extra scars. If not, well, at least your funeral was tax-deductible. Now here's where it gets even. More depressing, your value as a gladiator wasn't based on how healthy you were. It was based on how entertaining you were. A guy with a dramatic limp or some gnarly scars. Instant crowd favorite. A big belly that made hits look even bloodier. Bonus points. Gladiators were less athletes and more reality TV stars. Battered, bruised, and serving up tragedy for the masses, and the training never stopped. Even after surviving a few matches, you didn't get to kick back and enjoy your hard-earned coin. You went back to the ludus, back to swinging wooden swords, back to practicing stabs and parries for hours on end. The cycle was endless. Train, fight, survive. If you were lucky. And then do it all again. And again. And again. By modern standards, gladiators would be considered malnourished, overworked, and badly injured semi-professionals. Their fitness was survival fitness, raw, brutal, and unsustainable. It wasn't about being the fastest or strongest. It was about being tough enough to take a beating and smart enough to avoid a sword to the spleen. So next time someone tells you they're doing a gladiator workout, feel free to ask them where they keep their bone ash drink, their barley porridge, and their 20-kilogram death helmet. Bonus points if they can dodge a trident while doing burpees. Bottom line? You wouldn't last a day on a gladiator's diet, let alone a lifetime. And even if you did survive training camp, you'd be squishier, sweatier, and a whole lot more terrified than you ever thought possible. Congratulations, you survived gladiator training. Barely. Now it's time to start your career. Spoiler alert, being a gladiator was less living the dream and more living someone else's nightmare. Let's break down what the job actually entailed. First up, the gladiator types. You didn't get to choose your fighting style like a character in a video game. Trainers assigned you a class based on your physique, skill set, or frankly, whatever they thought would make a good show. And trust me, some of these roles were horrible. If you were big and slow, congratulations. You were probably assigned as a Mamillo, helmet shaped like a fish, huge rectangular shield, heavy sword. Your job, be a walking tank. The downside? You moved like a tortoise and probably fought guys who could run rings around you. If you were wiry and fast, you might end up a retiarius, a gladiator armed with a net and a trident. Sounds cool until you realize you have no armor. Just a shoulder guard and a whole lot of hope. Imagine walking into a knife fight wearing a tank top and carrying a barbecue fork. That's your vibe. Other types included the secutor, similar to the Mamillo, but with a different helmet designed specifically to counter the retiarius, and the Thraex, who wielded a curved sword and a small shield. Oh, and if you were lucky, read unlucky, you could end up as a bestiarius, who didn't fight other gladiators. They fought animals, lions, tigers, bears, literally. No thanks. Here's the thing. These pairings weren't about fairness. The Romans loved mismatches. They didn't want two equally matched gladiators putting on a strategic battle. They wanted spectacle, blood, drama, upsets. Like a reality show where someone actually loses a limb. The armor you wore wasn't designed with you in mind either. It was designed to make the fight interesting. It intentionally left weak spots exposed, gaping holes under the arms, at the thighs, around the neck, perfect targets for a well-aimed sword or spear. Why? Because drawn-out, bloody fights thrilled the audience. Gladiators weren't supposed to be invincible. They were supposed to be vulnerable. Visibility was another sick joke. Those iconic gladiator helmets, yeah, the ones that look awesome in movies, were practical nightmares. Small slits for eyes, a tiny vent for breathing, and a heavy metal casing turning your head into a portable sauna. You couldn't see much. You couldn't hear much. And breathing was like sucking air through a straw while running a marathon. Now, let's talk about the fight itself. Hollywood loves showing gladiators, fighting like maniacs, swinging swords wildly until someone falls dramatically. Reality? Gladiatorial combat was slow, deliberate, and tactical. These guys were trained not to waste energy. Every move was calculated, every blow measured. Charging blindly would get you dead in seconds. You had to be smart. Conserve your stamina. Wait for an opening. Exploit your opponent's weakness. It was more like brutal chess than an action movie. Only instead of losing a pawn, you lost a kidney. Even your death was choreographed. Or at least expected. If you fell, you were supposed to accept it gracefully. Struggle or beg for mercy, and you looked weak. Show courage, and you might win. The crowd's favor. Maybe, possibly, probably not. And about that favor, the crowd mattered. A lot. These weren't silent spectators. They were an ancient Roman version of rowdy sports fans who could influence your life or death. If they liked you, they might shout for mercy. If they were bored or annoyed, they'd chant for your blood. One bad move, one unlucky stumble, and the same people who cheered your entrance would gleefully demand your head on a platter. Another myth. The infamous thumbs up, thumbs down signal. Popular culture tells us that thumbs up meant live, and thumbs down meant die. In reality, it's a bit murkier. Historians believe the crowd, or the editor, the official overseeing the games, might signal with a closed fist for mercy or a thrust thumb for death. Either way, it was bad news if the people weren't feeling generous that day. And let's not forget who paid your wages. The lanista, your trainer, owner, or the editor of the games, often a politician looking, to buy public love with a good bloodbath. Gladiators weren't freelancers. They were investments. You fought when and where you were told, against whoever they picked, no complaints. Win or lose, the job wasn't about honor. It was about putting on a show, a very bloody show. Gladiators were entertainers, not soldiers. Your job wasn't just to kill. It was to die, dramatically. The crowd loved a good death, almost as much as a good fight. Winning didn't even guarantee safety. Even if you bested your opponent, you might still face execution if the crowd or editor thought you fought poorly or cowardly. Gladiators could be killed for not being exciting enough. And if you lived, congratulations. You got to do it all over again next week, and the week after, and the week after that, until, inevitably, your luck ran out. The reality is, gladiators weren't warriors in the noble sense. They were commodities. Disposable pawns in a blood-soaked game designed to entertain thousands of bored Romans. Your best skill wasn't strength or speed. It was endurance, physical, mental, emotional. If you couldn't endure the pain, the pressure, the constant looming threat of death, well, there was always room for one more corpse in the arena. So, you've survived training, suited up in armor designed by someone who clearly hated you, and stepped into the arena. Congratulations, you're now officially a sitting duck. Because here's the brutal truth. You're probably already dead. First off, let's talk odds. Your chances of survival weren't great. Historians estimate that in the early days of gladiatorial combat, about 1 in 5 fights ended in death. Not horrible, you say? Well, hold on. As time went on, especially during the height of Rome's bloodlust, those odds got much worse. Some games saw death rates of 1 in 3 or even 1 in 2. That's not a career. That's a countdown. And it wasn't just dying that was bad. It was how you died. Gladiatorial matches didn't have referees to call timeouts or stop the fight when someone got hurt. You weren't allowed to tap out or plead for a break. The only real way out of the arena was through victory or death. Sometimes both, depending on the crowd's mood. Speaking of moods, the crowd was savage. You could be fighting the best, match of your life, dodging blows, landing strikes, putting on a tactical masterclass, and still lose if the crowd was bored. Romans wanted drama. They wanted spectacle. They didn't care about skill if it wasn't exciting. You trip and fall, they laugh. You get stabbed but keep going, they cheer. You try to run, they boo, and running almost guaranteed a brutal, humiliating end. Gladiators who fled weren't shown mercy. They were cornered, beaten, and dispatched in the most embarrassing way possible. Dying bravely was your only chance at dignity, assuming dignity matters when you're bleeding out on sand. And remember that armor you're wearing. It's designed to fail. Those strategically placed gaps in your defense meant the smallest misstep could cost you dearly. A single missed parry, a slip on the blood-slicked ground, a brief moment of hesitation, and suddenly you've got a sword poking through your ribs. Fun fact, helmets restricted vision so badly that many gladiators were killed by side strikes they never even saw coming. Another fun addition to this misery buffet: blood loss. Even if you managed to avoid fatal wounds, every scratch, every slice, every spear nick slowly drained your strength. Lose enough blood, and your limbs turn to jelly. Your vision blurs. Your heart struggles to keep up. And then, boom, down you go. A slow-motion collapse, with the crowd screaming for the final blow. Oh, and heat stroke. Let's not forget that. Gladiatorial games were often held in the hot, midday sun, in a packed amphitheater with thousands of sweaty bodies radiating heat. Wearing a metal helmet and heavy armor, while battling for your life under the scorching sun, it's basically an ancient Roman sauna, except instead of eucalyptus towels, you get exhaustion, cramps, and blackout. Think you could pace yourself? Think again. The fights weren't drag-it-out marathons. They were intense, brutal bursts of violence. Lasting more than a few minutes without serious injury was rare. Your body would be screaming for water, rest, and mercy, and get none of it. And don't hold your breath for fair matchups. Gladiators were often pitted against opponents who were faster, stronger, or better armed. Sometimes this was random, sometimes it was intentional. The organizers loved a good mismatch, especially if it meant a dramatic underdog victory. Spoiler, most underdogs just got slaughtered. Let's also clear up a myth. Dying didn't guarantee a quick exit. If you were seriously wounded, but not instantly dead, you might be dragged to the edge of the arena and have your throat slit by a guy called the Dispulsaurus, basically the ancient Roman version of a cleanup crew. They weren't gentle, they were efficient. You didn't get last words or a dramatic goodbye. You got a knife and a quick trip to oblivion. And if the crowd or editor wasn't sure if you were truly dead, they might order a mercy blow, a final strike to the head to make sure you weren't faking. Gladiators were sometimes poked with hot iron rods or stabbed again to confirm death, because nothing says good game like being set on fire to see if you'll twitch. Oh, and that whole thumbs up, thumbs down thing. Total myth. Ancient Roman sources suggest it was more complicated. A closed fist with the thumb pressed against it probably meant mercy. A thumb thrust outward, sort of like a dagger, signaled death. Either way, your fate was being decided by thousands of drunk, sweaty Romans who paid a few coins to watch people like you die. Let's say, miracle of miracles, you won. Great. Enjoy your fleeting victory. You get to return to your barracks, nurse your wounds with a bandage made from yesterday's laundry, and maybe, just maybe, keep the few coins tossed at you like a busker on a bad night. But winning didn't mean you were safe. You could be called back to fight the next day, or the next week, or whenever your owner decided he needed more entertainment. You weren't climbing a career ladder, you were riding a carousel of doom, and the only way off was death or retirement, which most gladiators never reached. And if you're thinking, well, what about the champions? Sure, some gladiators became famous. A few even gained their freedom. But they were the exceptions, not the rule. For every victorious gladiator who earned the coveted rudies, a wooden sword symbolizing freedom, hundreds more bled out anonymously in the sand, their names forgotten before the next fight even started. Bottom line, gladiators were disposable. You were there to fight, bleed, and die for the amusement of others. And while modern movies love to paint them as noble warriors battling for honor, the reality was grimmer, bloodier, and a whole lot shorter. So no, you wouldn't last a day. Statistically, you wouldn't last half a day, and if you somehow did, well, you'd still be scheduled to die spectacularly next week. Ancient Rome didn't do second chances. They barely did first ones. Let's say, against all odds, you've not only survived the arena, but managed to string together a few wins. Congrats, you're now what passes for a celebrity in ancient Rome. Don't get too excited. Gladiator fame came with more strings attached than a Roman marionette. First off, yes, you could become famous. Gladiators were ancient Rome's version of reality TV stars. Your face could be plastered on walls in crude graffiti, your name chanted by the mob, and your victories sung about in taverns. Some gladiators, like the legendary Flamma or Spiculus, became massive celebrities. Even emperors admired them. Nero, history's least favorite maniac, is said to have gifted Spiculus an actual palace. Sounds great, right? Fame, adoration, gifts. Well, not so fast. Gladiators weren't famous for being noble heroes. They were famous for bleeding well, literally. You were entertainment, not a role model. The same people cheering you on Tuesday would boo you on Wednesday if you had an off day. And here's the kicker. You were still a slave, or at best a highly regulated free agent. That's right. No matter how many fans you had, you were still property. You couldn't buy land, you couldn't vote, and you definitely couldn't say, I'm tired, I'm taking a break. Your owner, the lanista, decided when you fought, where you fought, and if you fought with a sword or a broomstick for laughs. This wasn't the kind of fame where you get a personal chef and a Netflix deal. It was the kind of fame where you were paraded around half-naked, forced to fight for your life, and occasionally loaned out for private entertainment. Yes, private. Wealthy Romans could rent popular gladiators for parties, not to fight, but just to stand around and look intimidating while drunk senators showed off. Still think fame sounds worth it? It gets better, or worse, depending on your perspective. Roman women were obsessed with gladiators. The sight of a sweaty, scarred warrior sent them into fits of passion. Gladiators were the bad boys of ancient Rome, and some women couldn't resist. There are accounts of high-born ladies sneaking out to rendezvous with their favorite fighters, risking scandal, disgrace, and divorce. You might think, hey, at least the love life is good. Except it wasn't love. It was obsession. Gladiators weren't seen as romantic partners. They were exotic, dangerous trophies, thrilling for a night, disposable the next morning. And if a powerful husband or a scorned lover took offense, well, let's just say gladiators made a lot of enemies they didn't even know about. As for marriage, forget it. Roman law didn't allow gladiators to marry. You could have unofficial relationships, sure, but you were always one bad fight away from leaving your girlfriend a very eligible widow, and don't think you could cash in on your fame with endorsements or merch sales. Gladiators didn't get paid per se. They got winnings, sometimes a small purse if they survived a match, maybe some gifts or tips from a generous editor or crowd. But most of what you earned went straight to your lanista. You were an investment. The more famous you got, the more your owner profited, not you. Even the gifts you could keep, like prize money or rings, weren't exactly life-changing. Sure, they could help buy you better food or a slightly less rat-infested cell. But retirement, a villa in the countryside, keep dreaming. And retirement itself was rare. To retire honorably, you had to win a series of battles and be awarded a rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing freedom. Sounds simple? It wasn't. Many gladiators fought for years without ever seeing that little stick. Even if you did earn it, freedom came with new problems. You were broke, covered in scars, traumatized, and still viewed by polite Roman society as slightly above a criminal. Oh, and one more thing. A freed gladiator couldn't just join regular society and open a bakery. Gladiator status was sticky. Once a fighter, always a fighter. Most former gladiators either returned to the games as trainers, became bodyguards, or slipped into crime. No respectable career path started with former murder sport entertainer. Even winning didn't guarantee physical health. Years of bone-deep injuries, infections, and concussions left survivors crippled. Many had missing fingers, permanent limps, vision problems from helmet damage, and chronic pain. Ancient Rome didn't have physical therapy, just poppy juice and a suck-it-up mentality. Mentally, just as bad. Imagine living in a world where every day could be your last, where friends died in front of you, where betrayal was common, and where the crowd that adored you could turn on you in an instant. PTSD wasn't officially diagnosed back then, but gladiators probably experienced it by the cartload. Even burial rites weren't a given. Gladiators who didn't save enough money, and that was most of them, got dumped in mass graves. No tombstone, no epitaph, no family gatherings in their honor, just a heap of bones, quickly forgotten. So yes, fame was possible. You could have. Fans, admirers, even lovers. You could have your name shouted in the streets and scribbled on the walls, but you couldn't have freedom, or stability, or peace. Being a famous gladiator was a lot like being a candle at a Roman feast, bright, admired, and guaranteed to burn out fast. And when you did, the crowd would barely pause before turning their attention to the next poor soul stepping onto the sand. Okay, so now you're a big-name gladiator. You've survived brutal training, fought your way to fame, maybe even have a few fans scribbling your name on walls. Sounds like you've made it, right? Not exactly. See, there's a part of the gladiator, life that ancient writers didn't romanticize much, the psychological toll. Because while the body took plenty of hits, the mind got absolutely wrecked. First off, let's talk about the constant fear. Imagine waking up every morning knowing today could be the day you die horribly in front of 50,000 screaming strangers. Gladiators lived under a ticking clock. Every match, every training session, every public appearance carried the looming threat of injury or death. There were no easy days, there were no breaks. Just a non-stop adrenaline rush soaked in blood and existential dread. You couldn't trust anyone either. Gladiators trained together, ate together, lived in the same barracks, and then fought each other to the death for public amusement. Friendship? Sure. Right up until you got paired against your buddy in the arena. No hard feelings, except the ones caused by a trident through the ribs. This wasn't just physically exhausting, it was mentally corrosive. How do you build camaraderie when everyone you know is a potential future corpse, or worse, your future opponent? You'd learn to keep emotional walls up, distance yourself, suppress anything resembling normal human feelings. Gladiators weren't just trained to fight. They were trained to detach, and the crowd, as much as they cheered you, they were part of the nightmare. Gladiators were ancient Rome's reality stars, but the fame came without any real love. The audience didn't care about your hopes or dreams. They cared about how spectacularly you could bleed out. The same hand that tossed you a flower today could give the signal for your execution tomorrow. Imagine the mental gymnastics needed to process that. Perform well, get applause, show weakness, get death. Survival depended not just on fighting skill, but on public approval. Your fate was at the whim of a bloodthirsty mob that treated life and death like entertainment. Anxiety, depression, paranoia, practically built into the job description. Speaking of job description, let's not forget that most gladiators were slaves. Fame didn't change the fact that you had no autonomy. Your days, your fights, even your death, all decided by someone else. Feeling powerless is hard enough. Feeling powerless while constantly facing death. That's another level of psychological torture. And don't kid yourself. Suicide was common. Some gladiators chose to end their lives before ever stepping into the arena. They'd starve themselves, strangle themselves with whatever was available, or even throw themselves onto their own weapons. Not because they were cowards, but because they knew what waited for them, and they wanted control over at least one thing in their lives: the end. One grim historical tidbit. There's a story of a group of gladiators who strangled themselves with the chains used to lock their barracks at night. They'd rather die in a dark room than die entertaining a stadium full of strangers. That's how bleak the mental landscape was. Even those who did survive multiple matches weren't exactly basking in sunshine and rainbows. The mental trauma stacked up. PTSD wasn't a recognized condition in ancient Rome, but based on everything we know, gladiators showed all the signs: insomnia, flashbacks, emotional numbness, hypervigilance. Living in a constant state of fight or flight changes your brain. And gladiators never got a break from it. They also witnessed death constantly. Not movie death with dramatic music and slow fades, real death. Friends, enemies, strangers, 1 minute fighting, the next twitching in the sand. Gladiators got front row seats to human mortality every single day. Death wasn't an abstract concept. It was Tuesday. Worse still, there was no counseling, no therapy, no wellness retreats. If you couldn't handle it, you drank yourself numb or fought until you didn't have to anymore. Opium and wine were the ancient Roman version of coping mechanisms, except they dulled your reflexes and made you a worse fighter. So even your escape routes came with death baked in, and for the tiny number of gladiators who actually gained their freedom, the mental scars didn't fade. You can't just walk away from years of bloodshed and cheerfully rejoin society. Many freed gladiators, ended up taking jobs that kept them close to violence, bodyguards, mercenaries, criminal enforcers. Why? Because swinging swords and surviving chaos were the only skills they had left. Others became trainers, reliving their trauma day after day, passing on the same brutal lessons they once endured. Some even returned to the arena voluntarily. Not because they loved it, but because the arena was the only place they ever felt alive, the only place that made any sense after years of madness. And let's not forget the loss of identity. Outside the arena, you were nobody. Gladiators were famous in the games. Outside, they were still social outcasts. You weren't invited to fancy parties or political debates. You were still considered tainted, brutalized, less than. Imagine being famous, but universally shunned. It's like being a viral meme that no one actually likes in real life. If you're thinking, well, at least they had each other, don't get too sentimental. Gladiators might bond out of necessity, but they lived knowing any day could end with a sword between the ribs from the same guy they shared lunch with. Trust was a luxury, and luxuries got you killed. So let's recap. You're living under constant threat of death, surrounded by potential enemies, fighting for the approval of a mob that sees you as disposable, with no real friends, no future, and no way out. Even if you survive, you're a broken, traumatized shell of a human being who's more likely to end up a drunk, a mercenary, or a cautionary tale than a happy retiree. In short, you wouldn't just lose your life as a gladiator. You'd lose yourself, piece by bloody piece, fight by brutal fight. All right, let's imagine the morning of the big day. You've survived the training, the backstabbing, literal and emotional, and the soul-crushing mental toll. Now it's time for the grand finale, game day. But before you grab your sword and strut out like a hero, let's set expectations straight. Gladiator game days weren't the noble competitions of modern sports. They were public bloodbaths wrapped in ritual, spectacle, and a whole lot of bad smells. The day didn't start with you walking out into glory. It started way before that, with pre-game rituals designed to dehumanize and humiliate. First, you'd line up with the other gladiators in a public parade, the Pompa, decked out in your uncomfortable armor, marching past thousands of jeering Romans, sweating under the sun while a band played festive music. Think of it like a really dark Thanksgiving parade, but instead of floats, they had people doomed to die. Your armor wasn't there for your protection. It was there for the show. Helmets were polished until they gleamed, shields emblazoned, with your brand, and swords sharpened for maximum theatricality. No comfy sneakers here. You were either barefoot or strapped into stiff, painful sandals that made every step feel like you were walking on Legos. As you paraded around, the crowd took a good long look. They shouted. They placed bets. They pointed at you like you were livestock at auction. Why? Because that's exactly what you were. A gladiator was property, and game day was less a contest and more a public execution with a side of gambling. And if you were hoping for a warm-up, don't worry. The Romans had you covered. Before the actual fight started, gladiators warmed up by practicing against wooden dummies or sparring lightly with fellow fighters. Except by lightly, we mean don't actually kill each other. Warming up was mostly about hyping the crowd, showing off your footwork, and reminding everyone how skilled you were before things got ugly. But hold up. You didn't even get to fight first. The morning events belonged to the opening acts, executions and animal fights. Criminals, prisoners of war, and political enemies were thrown into the arena to be mauled by wild beasts, lions, bears, leopards, you name it. If you were unlucky enough to be assigned as a venator, an animal fighter, you could find yourself battling a ticked-off elephant before lunch. And these weren't fair fights either. Sometimes the animals were half-starved to make them extra aggressive. Sometimes they were deliberately injured to make the show bloodier. It was brutality with a side of cruelty. The perfect Roman appetizer before the main gladiatorial feast. Once the beasts had been satisfied, or more likely, once the ground was soaked in enough blood, it was your turn. The crowd, already whipped into a frenzy by the carnage, was primed and ready. They weren't looking for careful duels or honorable standoffs. They wanted action. They wanted drama. They wanted death. You'd enter the arena to the roar of tens of thousands of spectators. The Colosseum, if you were unlucky enough, to fight there, could hold up to 50,000 people. That's a lot of eyes watching your every move, waiting for you to entertain them, or die trying. And don't think you'd be sneaking in under cover of darkness. Gladiator games happened under the brutal midday sun. The arena floor would be blazing hot. Your armor would bake you like a human casserole. Sweat would pour down your face, sting your eyes, and blur your already limited vision. The sand you fought on wasn't just dirt. It was often mixed with pulverized marble to absorb blood better and prevent slipping. Spoiler, it didn't help. Fighting on that surface was like trying to sprint across gravel while carrying a refrigerator on your back. And the smell? Horrific. Blood, sweat, open wounds, rotting meat from the earlier animal fights, and $50,000, people packed together with zero concept of deodorant. If you didn't pass out from the heat, the stench alone might knock you down. Now, before the fight, you'd probably salute the emperor or the editor running the games. Av, Imperator, Morituri te salutant. Hail, Emperor. Those who are about to die salute you. Fun fact, not every gladiator actually said this. It was mostly used by condemned criminals, but hey, pop culture loves it. Then it was go time. No breaks, no timeouts, no mulligans. You fought until the other guy was dead, maimed, or so. Thoroughly defeated, that the crowd decided his fate. The editors and audience had absolute power over life and death, and they loved using it. And if you think the matches were polite or sportsmanlike, think again. The best gladiators didn't fight with honor. They fought with strategy. Feints, trips, dirty moves, all fair game. Pin your opponent's shield to the ground. Good. Kick him in the knee and break his balance. Excellent. Win fast, win smart, or die stupid. The crowd didn't want a quick kill. They wanted a show. They wanted to see a struggle, a reversal, a glorious last stand. Killing your opponent too fast could make them angry, and you did not want to make the crowd angry. A boring fight meant the editor might decide both of. You needed to die just to keep the mood festive. And even when you thought you'd won, it wasn't over. You had to wait for the editor's judgment. If the crowd cheered for your opponent, he might get mercy. If they jeered, he was done. And sometimes, the editor made decisions purely for political reasons, letting a popular fighter live to please the masses, or executing a skilled one to seem tough. The only thing predictable about game day was the unpredictability. You could be the best fighter in the arena and still die because the crowd was bored, the editor was moody, or the emperor wanted to set an example. Bottom line, gladiator games weren't just battles. They were blood-soaked pageants, carefully designed to wring every last drop of drama out of human suffering. And if you thought surviving training was hard, surviving game day was like walking a tightrope over a pit of lions while blindfolded in a windstorm. Now that you're standing on the arena floor, sweaty, stressed, and probably questioning every life decision that got you here, it's time to fight. But here's the catch. This isn't a sloppy bar brawl. Gladiatorial combat wasn't about rage or raw strength. It was about strategy. Brutal, bloody, sand-caked strategy. First lesson, wild swinging gets you dead. Fast. Gladiators were trained fighters, not berserkers. Every move had to be calculated. Why? Because armor was heavy, the arena was hot, and adrenaline burns out quicker than you think. One wild lunge, one missed swing, and you'd leave yourself wide open for a counterattack. And believe me, your opponent was waiting for exactly that. Forget the Hollywood slow-motion leaping. Attacks. Real gladiators fought low, tight, controlled. Quick jabs, feints, calculated footwork. More like a violent game of chess than a barroom brawl. Think short bursts of violence, with long stretches of cautious circling, probing for weakness. And footwork? Absolutely critical. You didn't just stand and slug it out. You kept moving, circling, pivoting, shifting weight, trying to find an angle where your opponent's armor was weakest. Remember, that armor wasn't built for total protection. There were gaps under the arms, behind the knees, the sides of the neck. You just had to survive long enough to find one. Gladiators learned to read their opponents like a poker player reads a table. Was he favoring his left leg? Breathing harder out of one side of his mouth? Dropping his shield just a bit when he swung? Every tiny tell could mean the difference between life and death. And no, you didn't get to pause and analyze. You had to see it, react, and exploit it in real time, with the crowd screaming for blood in your ears. Stamina management was another key. Gladiators knew better than to go all out from the opening bell. Sprinting around the arena in 30 kilograms of armor under the blazing sun was a one-way ticket to collapse. The best fighters conserved their energy. Short bursts, controlled, breathing, economical movement. No wasted steps, no wasted strikes, and don't forget showmanship. Gladiators weren't just trying to survive, they were trying to entertain. You needed to sell it. Fake a stumble to lure your opponent in. Exaggerate a dodge to rile up the crowd. Play dead until the last second for a surprise counterattack. A good gladiator wasn't just a fighter, he was part athlete, part actor, part magician. Of course, this wasn't without risks. Playing it too safe could bore the crowd. And if the crowd got bored, well, we've covered what happens. Hint, it ends badly for you. So you had to walk a fine line between smart tactics and flashy risk-taking. Make it look dangerous even, if you're playing it as safe as humanly possible. And yes, dirty tricks were part of the playbook. Tripping, feinting, using the sand to blind your opponent, all totally acceptable. Gladiators fought to survive, not to win style points. You could slam your shield into someone's face, hook a trident under their knee, even use the environment, slippery blood pools, loose sand, to your advantage. There were no referees to blow a whistle for foul play. Weapon choice also mattered a lot. You might be a Mamiya with a short sword and a massive shield, great for blocking but slow to swing. Your opponent might be a retiarius with a net and trident, looking to entangle you before stabbing you like a kebab. Every fight was a rock-paper-scissors matchup, and you had to adapt fast. Armor type, too, changed everything. Heavier armor gave you more protection, but slowed you down and made you an easy target if you got tired. Lighter fighters moved quicker, but risked getting skewered if they weren't careful. It was a constant balancing act, and one you had to master on the fly. Another harsh truth: injuries were inevitable. Nobody walked away from a fight clean. Gashes, broken fingers, busted ribs, part of the deal. Winning wasn't about staying untouched. It was about staying functional longer than your opponent. You might win a match with a dislocated shoulder and a bleeding thigh as long as you stayed standing. Blood was a given. The only question was whose, and if you thought fighting dirty was limited to what you did inside the arena, think again. Sabotage wasn't uncommon. Blunted weapons, tampered armor straps, bad advice from trainers, anything to get an edge. Remember, this wasn't a brotherhood, it was survival. And there were always politics at play. If a certain editor wanted a particular gladiator to win or lose, funny things could happen behind the scenes. Oh, and if you were counting on a quick, clean death if you lost, good luck. Gladiators were trained to drag out their deaths, to stagger and collapse dramatically, for maximum effect. Even the final blow, missio, was often a prolonged, gruesome affair. If you didn't die immediately, you could lie there bleeding while the crowd and editor debated your fate. Let's not forget team fights either. Mass battles where groups of gladiators fought together. You might think this would be easier. Safety in numbers, right? Wrong. It was total chaos. Swords swinging everywhere, alliances breaking down mid-fight, the whole arena turning into a swirling mess of panic and blood. Friendly fire wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Bottom line, gladiator combat wasn't just about brawn. It was a mind game played at knife point, where one mistake could get you skewered, and the only prize was the chance to do it all over again next week. So yes, there was blood, there was sand, but without strategy, you were just another soon-to-be corpse giving the crowd exactly what they came for, a good show and a quick death. So you've trained like a machine, fought like a tactician, and entertained like your life depends on it, because it literally does. Feeling good? You shouldn't, because in ancient Rome, the deck wasn't just stacked against you. It was practically falling over. Let's start with the match fixing. Gladiator fights weren't always fair. Shocking, I know. Who would have thought the ancient world had the same corruption issues as your fantasy football league? Organizers loved to rig fights for maximum entertainment, political favors, or just personal vendettas. If a wealthy patron bet heavily on your opponent, don't be surprised if you find yourself randomly assigned a chipped sword or a shield with a conveniently loose strap. And if you were unlucky enough to face off against a local hero or a crowd favorite, good luck getting an even match. Some fights were designed as set pieces, legendary champions versus fresh meat like you. Your job wasn't to win, your job was to make the champion look good. Basically, you were the warm-up act that gets booed before the headliner even steps on stage. Now, if you're thinking, I'll just bribe someone, nice try. You're a gladiator, remember? You're broke, enslaved, and the few coins you might have earned went straight to your lanista. You had about as much financial muscle as a pigeon trying to buy a chariot. And speaking of lanistas, these guys were the original sports agents. Except instead of negotiating million-dollar endorsement deals, they were selling you like cattle. You were an investment, a commodity, a breathing lottery ticket. If you died in the arena, sure, they'd lose a few coins, but they had dozens more fighters in training. You were expendable, and if it made them look good to have a stable full of victorious champions, great. If not, there's always fresh blood to replace you. It wasn't just the trainers and bookies tipping the scales. Politicians played dirty too. Gladiator games were the Roman version of campaign rallies. Powerful men threw lavish games to win public favor. And nothing delighted a Roman crowd like an underdog story. Sometimes you got thrown against overwhelming odds, not because you were hated, but because it made for good PR, when you inevitably got flattened like a poorly made pancake. And here's another dirty secret. Not all gladiators were created equal. Some fighters, especially those who were free men and volunteered, received better training, better equipment, and better treatment. You, the enslaved no-name from Gaul or Thrace, you got the hand-me-down gear, the cracked shield, and a pat on the back that said, "Try not to die too fast." Worse yet, gladiator types weren't always paired logically. Sure, the Romans loved matchups like the retiarius, net and trident guy, versus the secular, heavy shield and sword. But sometimes, for sheer chaos, they threw together mismatched styles. A lightly armored guy against a full tank. A speedster against someone who could take a dozen hits without blinking. If it made the crowd roar, it was considered fair, or at least entertaining enough to not care about fairness. And don't expect medical care if you made it out alive but maimed. Gladiators weren't treated like star athletes. They were patched up like old shoes. Medical attention was basic at best and horrifying at worst. A deep gash? They might sew it up. No anesthesia, of course. A broken bone? Maybe they'd set it, or maybe they'd just splint it badly and tell you to walk it off. Survival of the fittest wasn't a slogan. It was the operating procedure. There was also the fun bonus of forced rematches. Maybe you survived a brutal bout. Congrats. Guess what? The crowd loved it so much they demanded a rematch. You could find yourself back in the sand facing the same opponent a few days later. Only this time, you were still recovering from the cracked ribs and punctured lung you got last round. And if you think luck was on your side, think again. Romans were superstitious to the core, and that bled into the arena. A bad omen, a sneeze, a bird flying the wrong way, a dropped weapon, could doom you before the first blow was struck. If the crowd decided the gods weren't on your side, you were already dead in their eyes, and mercy would be in short supply. And let's not forget equipment sabotage. Rivals, trainers, even guards might tamper with your gear to tilt the odds. A sword hilt loosened just enough to snap mid-swing. Armor straps frayed to break under stress. Your helmet's lining thinned so that one good hit would ring your bell, like a cheap gong. If you trusted anyone with your life, you were asking for trouble. Oh, and about the animals. Yeah, sometimes they decided to spice things up with an unexpected beast. One minute you're facing another human being. The next, a half-starved lion is sprinting toward you because someone thought, you know what this fight needs? A cat with anger issues. Gladiators often had no warning when organizers decided to unleash a surprise guest into the arena. Hope you're good at improvising, but here's the real kicker. Even if you fought bravely, skillfully, and with every ounce of strength you had, you still weren't guaranteed survival. Victory didn't mean life. It meant you got to stand there gasping, while the editor or emperor decided whether you were entertaining enough to keep around. You could defeat your opponent, only to be sentenced to death, because you didn't bleed enough, or your win wasn't flashy enough for the crowd's liking. Winning wasn't enough. Fighting well wasn't enough. Even living well wasn't enough. Gladiators existed in a system rigged from the get-go, a theater of blood where the house always won, and you were just the disposable entertainment. So the next time someone says, "If I were a gladiator, I'd just fight smarter," you can smile and nod, because no matter how smart, strong, or skilled you were, the system was designed to make sure you didn't last long enough to get smart about it. Let's say you beat the odds. You didn't get sabotaged, you didn't get mauled by an angry tiger, and you didn't collapse from heat stroke. You won. Incredible, right? Break out the champagne and fireworks? Not so fast. Because in the glamorous world of Roman gladiators, winning was just another flavor of losing, slightly delayed, slightly more humiliating. First, let's talk about prize money. Yes, winners were sometimes awarded a purse, a few silver coins, a small bonus, maybe even a crown of palm leaves. It sounds good until you realize most of it didn't stay in your pocket. A hefty chunk went straight to your lanista, your trainer, owner, manager, slave driver. You thought the house always wins in Vegas? Buddy, ancient Rome perfected that model 2,000 years ago. Whatever scraps you kept might buy you a slightly better meal, a new pair of sandals, or maybe, if you really saved up, a cheap gravestone when you inevitably kicked the bucket. Gladiators weren't stacking riches for a cozy retirement villa. They were lucky to avoid dying broke and maimed. Speaking of maimed, injuries didn't just magically heal because you won. You were still bleeding, limping, and possibly harboring an untreated infection. Gladiators had no team doctors, no physiotherapists, no protein shakes and massage chairs. Winning just meant dragging your busted body back to the barracks to fester in a cot surrounded by 50 other half-dead fighters. Ancient Roman healthcare was a joke, if you even got any. Sure, there were doctors, but they were more battlefield medics than miracle workers. They'd patch you up if they thought you were still profitable. Otherwise, a nice wet cloth and a shrug. They didn't even have the germ theory of disease, just a lot of hope and vinegar. Let's say you survive your wounds and manage to keep fighting. Great. Now you get the privilege of fighting again, over and over, until you lose. Winning just bought you another ticket to the next death match. You weren't climbing a ladder. You were running on a treadmill coated in blood, and the injuries piled up. Gladiator's skeletons show horrific damage: smashed jaws, cracked ribs, broken legs that healed crooked, and skull fractures so bad it's a miracle they ever got up again. Each win chipped away at your body, your mobility, your reaction time. Until one day, someone faster, younger, or just luckier took you down, and this time, you stayed down. But what about freedom? Wasn't there a way out? Yes. Technically, gladiators could be awarded a rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing their freedom, if they performed exceptionally well over several years. A rudis wasn't just a prop. It was your golden ticket to retirement. But here's the catch. Very few gladiators ever survived long enough to earn it. And even if you did, freedom was a bittersweet prize. Freed gladiators, called liberty, didn't return to society as heroes. They carried the stigma of their bloody profession. To the Roman elite, you were still that guy who murdered for money. You could never become a senator, a magistrate, or a respected citizen. You could open a tavern or work as a bodyguard. Thrilling career prospects if you're into getting stabbed on weekends. And freedom didn't magically erase the physical and mental damage. You left the arena with more scars than a bad relationship, missing teeth, and a limp that told the world you were once a gladiator. You had few marketable skills beyond swinging sharp objects at moving targets. And since the retirement plan for ex-gladiators was essentially, don't die. Many drifted into crime or sold their services as mercenaries. Still want to dream big? Let's talk about the so-called gladiator pension plans. Some schools or wealthy patrons set up funeral clubs or savings associations. Gladiators could contribute part of their winnings toward a group fund that would, in theory, cover burial costs. Not a beach house or a country estate. Just a hole in the ground and a marker that said, "Here lies another dude who didn't make it." And even if you earned wealth and freedom, the emotional trauma was permanent. Years of killing or nearly being killed, of friends dying in front of you, of constant adrenaline-fueled terror. These didn't fade just because you got a certificate and a handshake. Ancient Rome didn't have therapy sessions or support groups for PTSD. If you couldn't cope, your options were limited to drinking, fighting, or just not coping at all. Also, bear in mind that public attention didn't last. Gladiator fame was fleeting. One day you're the star of the show, and the next you're yesterday's bloodstain. New gladiators, new matches, new faces. Rome's appetite for violence was insatiable, and it didn't care about loyalty or legacy. And let's not forget the risk of freedom itself. A freed gladiator could be forced back into the arena for political reasons, or if they fell on hard times. Debt, enemies, bad luck, all could land you right back in the sand, older and weaker, facing fighters half your age and twice your hunger. So even winning big, didn't set you free. It just delayed the inevitable. Gladiator. Life was a rigged game, a cycle of violence where every exit door was guarded by more misery. In ancient Rome, success wasn't a guarantee of happiness. It was a slightly longer, slightly more painful march toward the same bloody end. So the next time you imagine yourself triumphantly standing in a Colosseum, basking in the roar of the crowd after a glorious victory, remember, you're not the hero of an epic. You're just the lucky guy who gets to die later rather than sooner. By now you're probably thinking, okay, fine, gladiator life sounds brutal, but at least death would be quick, right? Clean? Maybe even heroic? Oh, sweet summer child. In the grand, blood-soaked nightmare that was ancient Rome, death wasn't the worst part, not by a long shot. Let's start with the obvious. Dying was rarely quick or painless. Sure, sometimes you got lucky. A well-aimed sword thrust, a clean hit to the heart or the throat, and boom, lights out. But most gladiators didn't go out that neatly. They died slowly, painfully, in ways that would make even horror movie directors wince. Think about it. You're in armor that restricts your vision and movement. Your opponent is aiming for gaps, jabbing, slashing, trying to wear you down. A lot of gladiators died from cumulative wounds. A deep cut to the thigh that bled them out over half an hour. A punctured lung that left them gasping for air while the crowd roared for more. Internal bleeding, infection, shattered bones grinding together. These were standard fare. And that's if you actually died in combat. If you were wounded but still breathing when you hit the sand, things got even worse. See, Roman crowds didn't pay for half measures. If you couldn't get up, you'd wait, bleeding and helpless, until the editor made the final call. Mercy wasn't guaranteed. In fact, mercy was rare. If the editor gave the signal for death, and they usually did, because nothing gets a crowd going like a good execution, you were finished off by an attendant with a big hammer or a sword, known as the dispulsores. No, not a doctor. A glorified janitor whose job was to make sure the arena stayed tidy by ensuring you stopped twitching. Sometimes they bashed your skull in. Sometimes they slit your throat. Sometimes they stabbed you through the heart, if they were feeling generous. But quick mercy depended on their aim and their mood. Miss the mark? You get to feel every excruciating second of your own execution, and let's not even get into crucifixion. Yeah, that wasn't just for prisoners. Particularly hated or rebellious gladiators could be sentenced to die on a cross, a slow, agonizing death meant to send a message. Imagine surviving 10 fights, only to end your days nailed up in front of a jeering mob. Or maybe you fought so badly that you were thrown to the animals instead. Lions, bears, and leopards weren't there just for morning entertainment. They also served as creative executioners. Being mauled to death by a half-starved lion wasn't quick, and it sure wasn't noble. The beasts didn't kill cleanly. They tore, bit, and clawed while the crowd cheered every gruesome second. But hey, maybe you made it through the fight mostly intact. Guess what? Infection didn't care how famous you were. Without antibiotics, a simple scratch could turn into a raging, festering wound. Gladiators routinely died days or weeks after a match, rotting from the inside out thanks to gangrene, tetanus, or sepsis. And you didn't get to recover in a clean hospital bed. You got to die slowly in a dark, filthy barracks, chained to your cot so you wouldn't crawl away and mess up the floors. And dying wasn't the end of your humiliation either. What happened to your body? Unless you were a superstar or had a generous patron, you didn't get a nice funeral. You didn't get a tomb or a eulogy or a weeping widow tossing flowers into your grave. Nope. Most gladiators were tossed into mass graves. Pit burials, no markers, no ceremony. Just a hole in the ground filled with broken bodies heaped on top of each other like garbage. Out of sight, out of mind. Tomorrow's games needed fresh fighters and a clean arena. A few lucky gladiators. Joined burial clubs, basically ancient life insurance policies where you paid a fee, assuming you had anything to pay with, for a semi-decent funeral. But if you couldn't afford that, congratulations, you're anonymous forever. And your reputation? Fleeting. Gladiator fame was like Instagram fame, bright, flashy, and gone the moment someone younger, faster, or bloodier showed up. Even the legends, guys who won dozens of fights, faded from memory after a few seasons. No statues, no epic poems, just a name scratched into a wall or a cheap graffiti drawing somewhere near the arena. Think your fighting spirit might live on in your family. Think again. Most gladiators were slaves. Their children were born into slavery too. No inheritance, no legacy, just more suffering passed down the line. Freedom was rare, and even when it happened, it didn't erase the social stain. Gladiators were seen as necessary evils. Popular entertainment, sure, but not respectable. Citizens, and let's not ignore the worst part. You knew all of this going in. Gladiators weren't oblivious. They knew their odds. They knew how they'd likely end up. Every parade, Every match, every fake smile for the crowd was done with the cold, creeping knowledge that the best-case scenario was dying quick and being forgotten slower. The real nightmare wasn't dying. It was living long enough to watch. Yourself break down, body, mind, and reputation, before dying painfully and anonymously, while 50,000 strangers cheered your final moments. So no, death wasn't the worst part of being a gladiator. It was just the inevitable conclusion to a life designed for maximum pain, suffering, and public humiliation. So you finally keeled over in the arena, maybe skewered, maybe clawed to bits by an irritated lion, maybe just a slow, unceremonious bleed-out. Game over, right? At least you get some peace now? Well, about that afterlife you were hoping for. Don't get too comfortable. See, for all the drama of gladiatorial death, what came after was not exactly a hero's send-off. There were no grand funeral pyres, no marble tombs with solemn inscriptions, no misty-eyed loved ones pouring wine on your grave. For most gladiators, the afterlife started with your body being shoveled into a mass grave faster than you could say Ave Imperator. The unlucky ones, and that was the majority, ended up in giant pits. Romans called these puticuli, communal burial sites for the poor, the enslaved, the outcast. Think giant sandpits full of rotting bodies, lime sprinkled over the top, to keep the smell down. No names, no markers, no ceremonies. You were dumped, covered, forgotten. If you were very lucky, we're talking winning the ancient lottery lucky, you might have been part of a collegium, a burial club where members pooled resources to ensure a halfway decent funeral. The dues were a gamble. Pay while you lived, barely. And maybe, if you died on a winning streak or caught a rich patron's eye, you got a modest grave. Maybe a slab of rock with your name and a simple, "Here lies Marcus, who stabbed things." Good, but more often, mass graves, and good luck with your remains staying where they were buried. Grave robbing was a real side hustle back then. Gladiators, especially ones with any lingering fame, could have their bones dug up and sold for charms, amulets, or dubious magical purposes. Nothing says resting in peace like having your femur turned into a lucky charm. As for immortality through fame, don't hold your breath. Ancient Rome wasn't big on preserving gladiator legacies. You weren't Julius Caesar. You weren't Virgil. You were a passing amusement. Sure, the occasional graffiti artist might scrawl your name on a wall. Caius the Fearless, champion of 10 fights. But as soon as someone bloodier and flashier came along, your glory faded faster than cheap toga fabric. Some gladiators who racked up dozens of victories might earn a statue or a mention in poetry. But these were the superstars, the 1%. For every spiculus or flammer whose name survived, there were thousands who disappeared into historical dust, known only to the worms nibbling their unmarked bones, and forget any idea of heroic deification. Romans worshipped plenty of gods and demigods, but gladiators didn't make the cut. You died for public entertainment, not for divine glory. The gods weren't lining up to welcome you to Olympus, more like ignoring your RSVP. Even in the spiritual sense, you weren't exactly on the VIP list. Romans believed in shades, manes, spirits of the dead who lingered on. But being an ex-gladiator spirit didn't grant you much clout. You weren't revered as an ancestor. You weren't toasted at family dinners. If anyone remembered you at all, it was usually with a shrug and a, "Oh yeah, that guy who got gored by a bull last season." Your spiritual fate was about as bleak as your physical one. An eternity of anonymity, floating around like a has-been ghost no one invites to the after-party. Now, you might ask, what about Valhalla-style warrior heavens? Didn't the Romans have something cool like that? Not really. Roman religion was practical. Brave death in battle might earn a soldier respect, but gladiators weren't soldiers. They were entertainers. No Elysian fields, no heroic halls of glory. If anything, gladiators were seen as slightly tainted. Admired, maybe, but not truly respected. You didn't fight for Rome, you fought for spectacle. Big difference. And in society's eyes, that stain carried into death. Gladiators were always other, slaves, criminals, outsiders. Winning 100 fights didn't scrub that away. In the Roman class system, you couldn't claw your way to dignity with a sword. You were born into dignity, or you weren't. It gets worse. For some gladiators, especially those who were slaves, death meant freedom, literally. Roman law stated that a dead slave was no longer property. Congratulations, your emancipation papers came in the form of rigor mortis. And yet, even in death, your body could still be used. Some dead gladiators were propped up for victory parades or posthumous ceremonies, paraded like grisly trophies. Their broken bodies became political props, reminders of a patron's generosity or a politician's largesse. Your final legacy? A cold, bloodied body used to boost some senator's popularity with the same mob that had cheered your demise. Oh, and let's not skip the Roman love for souvenirs. Blood-soaked sand from the arena was sometimes collected and sold as keepsakes. It was believed to bring good luck, courage, fertility. You name it. So while your body was rotting in a pit, chunks of sand soaked in your literal life essence were being hawked in the ancient version of a gift shop. To sum up, you died gruesomely, were dumped unceremoniously, forgotten rapidly, and remembered, if at all, as just another Saturday afternoon distraction. No hero's afterlife, no golden chariots waiting in the sky, just bones in a pit and a name that faded before your blood even dried. If you were dreaming of gladiator glory, eternal fame, a warrior's honor, maybe a spot in a heavenly VIP lounge, you bet on the wrong horse. In ancient Rome, the best you could hope for was a quick death, a grave with your name on it, and a few extra minutes of crowd applause before they turned their attention to the next poor soul stepping into the arena. And even then, the sand would be raked clean, the blood would be covered, and your brief, brutal chapter would close without fanfare. So, next time you imagine life as a Roman gladiator, all glory, fame, and slow-motion victory poses, remember this: you'd be underfed, overworked, brutally injured, and forgotten faster than yesterday's gossip. Winning didn't mean freedom. Fame didn't mean respect. And death? Well, that was just the last punchline. Gladiators weren't heroes. They were disposable entertainment in a world that loved a good show and a short memory. So, maybe stick to watching Gladiator from your couch, safe, hydrated, and not one lion in sight. Trust me, you wouldn't last a day in the arena.